What kind of entertainment forces gladiators who refuse to fight to be crucified upside down while wild animals devour their still-living bodies? What kind of spectacle turns cowardice into a public show where rebellious gladiators are slowly burned alive using armor heated until it glows red-hot? What empire considers it normal entertainment to force warrior slaves to fight ravenous beasts using nothing but wooden sticks as weapons? Imagine that your understanding of gladiators comes from the film Gladiators starring Russell Crowe, where honorable warriors fight courageously for freedom and die with dignity in the arena. Imagine that your view of Roman games comes from epic portrayals where fighters choose glorious death over a dishonorable life, facing their fate with stoic bravery. Now imagine discovering that the reality of what happened to gladiators who refused to fight was so brutal that Hollywood producers deliberately censored these practices so as not to traumatize modern audiences. The truth about the fate of gladiators who refuse to fight will completely destroy any romanticized idea you may have about the honor of the Roman games. And what I will reveal here is documented in amphitheater records, accounts from contemporary historians, and funerary inscriptions that have survived for 2,000 years. We are talking about the Roman Empire between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, when amphitheaters were not merely places of entertainment, but instruments of political terror through which the state demonstrated its absolute power over life and death. Gladiators were not heroic warriors fighting for glory. They were terrified slaves forced to die for the amusement of the masses, under the threat of punishments worse than death in the arena. When you think of gladiators, you probably imagine brave men who chose to fight to the death rather than accept slavery. The documented reality was a system where refusing to fight resulted in punishment so elaborate and prolonged that a quick death in the arena became a relief desperately desired by the slaves themselves. The Romans did not punish rebellious gladiators out of vengeance or anger. They punished them as a public demonstration that challenging imperial authority, even in the smallest form, would result in consequences far beyond mere death. It was theater of terror, using human bodies as props for political lessons directed at the entire population. And the specific methods developed by the Romans to correct disobedient gladiators went far beyond any civilized concept of punishment proportional to the crime. But that was only the beginning. What you will discover about the special corrections applied to gladiators who demonstrated cowardice, about the elaborate spectacles specifically created to humiliate rebellious warriors, and about how the Romans transformed refusal to fight into crimes against the very fabric of imperial reality, will reveal that amphitheaters were not merely arenas of combat. They were laboratories of psychological domination on a mass scale. The Roman system classified gladiatorial refusal into 3 specific categories: ignavia, simple cowardice; contumacia, persistent disobedience; and seditio, incitement to rebellion. Each category had escalating punishments regulated by the lex gladiatoria, a legal code specifically created for the control of warrior slaves and established during the reign of Augustus in 27 BC. Ignavia resulted in damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, but not the swift version portrayed in movies. Cowardly gladiators were tied to poles and exposed to hungry animals for extended periods, with their wounds treated to prolong agony for days. The goal was to turn death into an educational spectacle that lasted long enough for its lessons to be fully absorbed by the audience. Marcus Manilius, a games editor in Pompeii between 45 and 52 AD, documented in preserved letters that gladiators guilty of contumacia were subjected to impossible fights, combats where they faced multiple armed opponents using only wooden shields, or were pitted against wild animals with dull swords and perforated armor. During the famous revolt of Spartacus in 73 BC, captured gladiators who had initially refused to fight received punishments that Plutarch described as worse than any death in the arena. They were forced to fight each other using torture instruments as weapons, in matches that continued until only one survived, only for that survivor to be slowly crucified over the course of 3 days. But that was only the beginning. The Ludus Punitionis, punishment school, functioned as a specialized center where rebellious gladiators were retrained through methods combining physical torture with psychological humiliation. Sextus Julius Frontinus established the first Ludus Punitionis in Rome in 69 AD, creating techniques that became a model for the entire empire. Gladiators were forced to train with weapons that caused pain but not death. Swords with heated tips, shields with interior spikes, helmets that restricted both vision and breathing. It was conditioning that made the real arena seem merciful by comparison. The historian Tacitus recorded that gladiators in the Ludus Punitionis were kept in a constant state of hunger, receiving only water and barley gruel, until they begged to fight in the arena as a form of relief from their suffering. It was systematic psychological breakdown that turned refusal into desperate longing for combat. Cassius Dio documented the case of Batiatus, a gladiator who refused to fight his own son in a special spectacle arranged by Nero. He was sentenced to the Circus Humiliationis, the arena of humiliation, where he was forced to fight dressed as a woman, wielding toy weapons, while children threw stones and excrement at him. And these administrative punishments were only the preparation for the methods reserved for the gravest crime of gladiatorial rebellion. The most elaborate Roman punishment for gladiatorial rebellion was the spectaculum prolongatum, the prolonged spectacle, where rebellious gladiators were kept alive in the arena for weeks through constant medical care, being wounded and healed repeatedly to maximize the duration of public suffering. Specialized doctors worked between combats to ensure that victims remained conscious throughout the process. Emperor Caligula perfected humiliation techniques that transcended physical death. Gladiators who refused to fight were forced to participate in naumachiae invertidae, inverted naval battles, where they fought Nile crocodiles in shallow pools, using only paddles as weapons. The objective was not to win, but to prolong the agony as the reptiles slowly tore their bodies apart. During the Games of Domitian in 89 AD, rebellious gladiators were subjected to ignis lentus, slow fire, where they were dressed in tunics soaked in oil and ignited gradually, beginning from the feet. Doctors applied ointments to delay the burns, ensuring the process lasted for hours, while the crowd watched the gradual decomposition. The method of familia gladiatoria, destructa, punished not only rebellious gladiators, but their entire families. Wives and children were forced to witness elaborate executions before being sold as slaves to brothels or mines. It was emotional blackmail used as public spectacle. And that was not the worst. Nero developed venaciones personalizadas, customized beast hunts, where cowardly gladiators faced animals specifically trained to inflict maximum pain without causing quick death. Lions were fed human meat for weeks to develop a preference for live flesh. Bears had their claws removed to prolong attacks, and hyenas were kept starving until they developed a controlled frenzy. The crux innovata, innovated crucifixion, bound rebellious gladiators to crosses with mechanisms that raised and lowered their bodies alternately, causing partial asphyxiation, followed by forced recovery. The process was repeated for days until respiratory muscles finally collapsed. Marcus Aurelius, paradoxically known for his Stoic philosophy, institutionalized psychological torture through simulacra mortis, simulations of death. Gladiators were falsely executed multiple times, interrupted hangings, simulated decapitations, superficial impalements, until they developed terminal psychosis. The ludus experimentum functioned as a laboratory where gladiators served as test subjects for new execution methods that were later applied to common criminals. Techniques included gradual dismemberment, controlled exposure to non-lethal poisons, and tests of human resistance to various forms of trauma. Gladiators were also used for educational demonstrations where different torture methods were applied simultaneously to educate the public about the consequences of challenging imperial authority. It was a living encyclopedia of human suffering, presented as family entertainment. But all these elaborate techniques were merely tools within a larger system that revealed how Rome truly controlled its empire through systematic terror. The shocking truth about what the Romans did to gladiators who refused to fight goes far beyond sadistic entertainment or disproportionate punishment. Rome created the first system of mass psychological terror in human history, a technology of social control that made it possible to govern 50 million people spread across 3 continents with only 300,000 soldiers. The elaborate punishments applied to rebellious gladiators were not about disciplining slaves. They were calculated public demonstrations intended to teach specific political lessons. To challenge imperial authority, even in the slightest way, was to invite suffering that transcended simple death. It was propaganda of terror, using human bodies as a medium of communication. Modern analyses of amphitheater records reveal that only 12% of gladiators actually refused to fight, but 100% of the urban population witnessed the punishments applied to those rebels. It was simple math: maximize psychological impact on the masses through the spectacular suffering of a few. Historian Keith Hopkins demonstrated that amphitheaters functioned as the state television of the Roman Empire, broadcasting political messages to illiterate populations through ritualized violence. Every elaborate execution was an educational program about the consequences of resisting imperial power. When the Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, its methods of population control did not vanish. They were absorbed by the Catholic Church, which adapted Roman techniques of public terror to control medieval populations. Elaborate executions of heretics, the auto da fe of the Inquisition, and public torture spectacles derived directly from protocols developed in Roman amphitheaters. Modern totalitarian regimes systematically study Roman methods of control through terror. Nazi documents reveal that SS officers analyzed amphitheater records to develop techniques of public humiliation in concentration camps. Stalin implemented spectacular executions based on Roman precedents to control the Soviet population. The true Roman genius was in transforming terror into voluntary entertainment. Populations were not forced to witness punishments. They paid for tickets, competed for better seats, and applauded executions as if they were sports events. It was social control disguised as public amusement. The system worked with mathematical precision for 500 years, maintaining internal stability even during military, economic, and political crises that should have caused social collapse. Rome proved that massive populations can be controlled indefinitely through ritualized terror applied with scientific accuracy. The shocking truth about gladiators who refused to fight is that their deaths created the most successful historical prototype of mass psychological domination, a model so effective that it still influences how modern authoritarian governments maintain control over populations that, logically, should be able to overthrow them. And it still works exactly as the Romans planned 2,000 years ago.